I wonder how many people in this room would consider themselves new song people, and how many would consider themselves old song people. Either preference is fine. But my encouragement to you is to grow in your ability to worship through whichever type of song comes least easily to you. And I believe in the process, you will be a more biblical worshiper. Here's another question. I wonder how many people think of themselves primarily as a thinking person or primarily as a feeling person. Many psychological tests have been designed to help us figure that one out. But we who are made in the image of the thinking and feeling God are called to develop both of those aspects of our personality. Paul calls us to be transformed by the renewal of our mind, to think on things that are excellent and true. And at the same time, we're to love the Lord our God with all of our heart, soul, and might. In his book, The Scandal of the Evangelical Mind, Mark Knoll points out that virtually all of the high moments in church history have been marked both by deep Christian life and deep Christian thought. And he warns us that the majority of the movements that have not had a strong intellectual component have descended into heresy. How important the mind is to our worship and to our faith. Worship that is only dry and cerebral cries out for the water of emotion. Worship that is only emotional can be cast aside when the first storm threatens it. Our worship times need to be filled both with songs that teach us the faith, like the song that Moses wrote, and also songs that express the deepest parts of our hearts. Biblical worship calls for both. So I think we're beginning to get the idea that we who are made in the image of God are multifaceted. There are many things about our personality, not just one, not just narrow. If we are to bring all of who we are to worship God, we will worship in materials that are old and new, that are thinking and feeling, and we will worship through psalms and hymns and spiritual songs. Now, you've heard that phrase many times. And if you're like I was, you might think those are three different words for the same activity, and that is singing. But if we dig deeper, we find that Paul was talking about three different types of songs. The Psalms being the biblical songs in the book of Psalms itself, or like the Song of Moses, the Song of Mary. Hymns being the polished Greek poetry of Paul's day, poetry that worshiped a god or taught about a god. And spiritual songs being more spontaneous and free expressions of worship, as we learn through music history sources. Paul does not say psalms or hymns or spiritual songs, take your pick. He teaches us that if we are to grow in Christ, we need all three. We need the biblical songs. We need the songs of John and Charles Wesley. We need the song God gave your Westmont worship leader yesterday morning. All of them are important. Let's open our hearts wide, not narrow, but wide, to God's gift. But what if singing psalms and hymns and spiritual songs does not come easily? What if some of that feels like completely foreign territory? Let me tell you about a lady in my church named Dorothy. She's a fine musician who, when she was in college, went to the Juilliard School of Music, perhaps the #1 music school in the nation. Well, maybe next to Westmont. And she, for years, has served in the church in music ministry. Then along came praise songs, and then worship bands, and then screens in the sanctuary. Dorothy didn't know what to make of it all. I don't even feel like it's my church anymore, she said to me one day with great angst. But Dorothy's not a quitter. And she took the challenge that I'm inviting you to take, and that is to rise above your own style preference and find out how it will help you grow in Christ. Some of those worship songs are pretty good, she said. They do go on, but I find them to be pretty worshipful as she grew in her ability. As followers of Christ, we are called to a lifelong journey, like Dorothy, of growing and stretching. Jesus never left anyone where he found them. And Paul calls us to grow up from milk to meat. All of us are at different places in our spiritual journey. So the form of that growth will be different for each one of us. But one thing is in common. It will always involve the discomfort of enlarging our borders. How does this influence our worship values? Author Marva Dawn calls all of us to stretch by teaching the gifts of the faith tradition to those who do not yet know and understand them, and teaching those who know and love the heritage some new forms in which it can be presented to others. But why is this so important? Why wouldn't it be better just to let everybody worship in the way that is comfortable to them? To a certain degree, of course. We all need to have points of connection to have a meaningful worship experience. But if our goal in worship is simply to give people what they want to hear and feel, how much harder will it be to proclaim the authentic call of Christ on our lives, which is usually anything but what we want to hear and feel? I'm a choir director. I know how to choose songs to make a choir happy. But I've learned, and I've come to the philosophy, that if the choir doesn't have at least one song in their folder at any given moment that they hate at the beginning, I am not doing my job. Why is this? Because my job is not to make them comfortable just with things that are easy for them and familiar. My job is to help them stretch and grow so that they'll learn more and then that they will like more, growing as musicians and growing as disciples of Christ. So when we encounter things that are foreign to us in services of worship here at Westmont, or in your home church, or in grandma's church, or in an English cathedral, or out in the African bush, I encourage you to find a way as a disciple of Christ to worship him in the unfamiliar, and you will grow in the process. So this morning we've looked at the Bible for what it means to come back to the heart of worship, to be a generation that seeks the face of the God of Jacob. We've seen that means embracing old and new, worshiping with our minds as well as our hearts, learning to worship through psalms and hymns and spiritual songs, and being ready to stretch and grow in the process. And if we do all of this, we will have come far in accomplishing the most important biblical principle of all, unity and love. How simple these words sound, and yet how hard it is to achieve in the multi-generational, multicultural, multi-ethnic body that is God's family. Wouldn't it have been easier if in the first century the church had just stayed an outgrowth of the Jewish community, people with similar values and background and preferences? But no, God threw the doors open to the entire Gentile world, as Peter learned in Acts 10 and 11. The God of endless variety and color has ransomed saints from every tribe and language and people and nation to be part of his enormous and often dysfunctional family. He has created us with immeasurable diversity, and our job is to come together as one to worship him. Years ago, when the style of worship in Protestant churches began to seriously change, I found myself at odds with a certain member of our church staff, a Westmont graduate, I might add. One night, he and I went to dinner to discuss our different points of view on worship, and we really went at it. When we came back to the church and went our separate ways, I had an epiphany experience as I was walking to my car. God showed me that both my colleague and I cared more about the rightness of our position than we cared about one another. And surely that did not please God. That was a turning point for me. For no matter how many verses you cite about worship style or song choice, you could say many, many, many more about unity and love in Christ's body. Paul says, above all, maintain constant love for one another, for love covers a multitude of sins. Love binds everything together in perfect harmony.